Hi, everyone. Happy New Year. This is our first show of 2023. I'm Colleen Stover, host of Aerospace's Space Policy Show. Don't forget to check us out on the socials at hashtag the Space Policy Show. Subscribe to us on YouTube if you want to be notified about any new videos that are put out by the Center for Space Policy and Strategy. We are now 3 years strong, almost. So there at the YouTube channel, you'll find plenty of videos to browse about all things space, from national defense space to climate change, from space traffic management to science and technology. We've got 7 different playlists for you to go through. But today's show, we're actually going to kick off 2023 with a little bit of a twist. Episode 112 is Fact or Fiction of Space Diplomacy. Now that is fact or science fiction of space diplomacy. So we've got our own Robin Dickey. She's talking to Gabriel Swiney. He's currently at NASA. And they're going to be talking about the ins and outs of how politics and diplomacy are portrayed in science fiction TV. So I'll kick it over to Robin for a fun discussion.
Thanks, Colleen. I'm really excited for this conversation today with Gabriel Swiney. We're going to be talking about science fiction. And the space community talks about science fiction a lot. At the risk of generalizing, I think many of us are huge science fiction nerds. For those of you watching this on video, you might be able to notice that I've got Battlestar Galactica posters over one shoulder and a Star Trek phaser over the other shoulder. And Gabriel here got a shirt from The Expanse. So we're really covering quite a lot of bases here. And that's what I hope to do in this conversation as well. So there's a lot of comparison between sci-fi movies and books and TV shows and technology. What's feasible, what's real, what's happening in the show that could happen in the real world in terms of warp drives or time travel. All of these discussions happen a lot, but what we're going to focus on today is another big theme of sci-fi shows, and that's the policy and the diplomacy that happens in these space stories. So I'm really excited to have Gabriel Swiney on today to be talking about some of his experiences in space policy and diplomacy. And as we go, we're going to be comparing these experiences and discussions about the facts on the ground and in space of diplomacy to what happens in these science fiction stories. So Gabriel, do you mind introducing yourself real quick to start us off?
Yeah, thanks, Robin. I'm so excited to be here on this podcast today. Like you said, my name is Gabriel Swiney. I have a couple jobs. My full-time day job is as a senior policy advisor at NASA, where I work advising the A-suite and senior policymakers on all kinds of policy issues. I also teach at Harvard Law School. I teach the first space law and policy class they have there. And before I was at NASA, I was a senior space law a lawyer at the U.S. Department of State and led our delegation to the legal subcommittee of COPUOS, worked with a bunch of folks throughout the interagency on space policy and legal things. And before that, I had a whole career before managing to switch over into space on diplomacy, doing international law stuff, everything from the use of force to sanctions to trying to stop wars and doing those kinds of negotiations. So I'm trying to bring all of that diplomatic experience and foreign policy experience to my work now in the space field.
Awesome. So just to get us started, do you have any personal favorite sci-fi shows or anything that really influenced your decision to go into the field of space diplomacy?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe it's not very creative, but Star Trek was really foundational in not only my love of science fiction, but really in my career path. I was a next generation guy, sort of growing up and going to school in the 90s. And that vision, it's sort of the Gene Roddenberry vision, but in particular, the STTNG vision of humanity working together and solving problems and trying to do it peacefully, recognizing that there will be problems, recognizing that there will be conflict. But the idea that humans could, and not just humans, but other species, but I'm just going to sort of think of people in general, that we could work together and really collaborate to solve problems with a constant desire to be more peaceful, be more inclusive, and achieve big things. That vision of what people and humanity and really the whole universe could be like was absolutely central in my decision to go into foreign policy and diplomacy. That's the kind of world writ large that I want us to live in. And, I saw what it could be like. I think that's one of the great things about science fiction is that it lets us imagine the future. Oftentimes it's negative, but sometimes it's positive. And that vision of a collaborative, peaceful future is one that I wanted to start making real. And diplomacy was the way I chose to do that.
I think that's probably a lot of people in the field share similar stories of how the optimism and the vision of Star Trek really helps people to see the possibilities for space and for society and collaboration. So since diplomacy and these kinds of interactions are at the heart of Star Trek, let's start there for our survey of sci-fi and diplomacy. It's fun to note that Star Trek episodes have come out across 6 decades. So Star Trek as a show, as a medium, is just about as old as space diplomacy itself, if you can believe it. So let's talk about some more specific examples of the Star Trek vision and how they display the policy and the diplomacy process. So what are some examples off the board of how they do diplomacy in Star Trek, and who does the diplomacy in Star Trek, and how does that compare to your real experiences?
Yeah, it's really a mixed bag. As you say, diplomacy and sort of solving problems through negotiation is an absolutely central feature of Star Trek. Some series more or less, but it's always there. And we see Starfleet officers, sometimes diplomats, really serving a crucial role in not only the plot, but in the universe building of Star Trek. And so a lot of times that's really good. That central vision that diplomacy and negotiation is a tool to use to solve big problems is great. And I think really quite accurate. Diplomacy is always happening behind the scenes, sometimes right in front of the camera in the Star Trek world. And that's just like real life. One, problem or complaint, or at least issue I do have with the way Star Trek treats diplomacy is, as you said, who does it? And maybe this is just a function of, we as the audience are following ships. It's typically the Enterprise, or maybe it's Deep Space Nine, a space station, if we're watching Star Trek Deep Space Nine. But the diplomacy we mostly see in Star Trek, with a few exceptions, is conducted by Starfleet officers. And there's this whole debate in the fandom about whether Starfleet and Star Trek is a military organization, whether Starfleet is or not. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. I don't think it really matters, because the point for me is that these folks aren't civilians. These are people who have other jobs. It's exploration, it's defense, and we see them do a lot of diplomacy, either because they're the first ones on the scene or because they've been dispatched by the Federation to solve some problem. And that is a little bit problematic to me. In the real world, and I think in an ideal world as well, you don't want people like that, sort of military officers or military-esque folks, sort of leading the charge in diplomacy. It's not a great idea for a couple of reasons. One is that they're just not experts at this. We have people like Captain Picard who are of course very skilled at these kinds of topics, but the reality is that military officers are trained to do a different thing, right? They're trained in security and the application of the use of force and all of those associated issues. And diplomacy is an actual skill. A lot of people don't necessarily think of it that way, but diplomacy and negotiation is something that has to be learned, and it has to be taught. And it's the kind of thing that you get better at over time. So having what I would consider sort of amateurs or people do it on the side as added on to a much broader and different mission is concerning, just because they're not going to have the skill set to do those kinds of things. So it's also concerning from frankly, a democracy and governance perspective. Diplomacy and foreign relations generally is absolutely central to the concept of sovereignty, to the concept of what it means to be a nation or political entity, whether you're a country on Earth right now, or whether you're the United Federation of Planets. And something that's central to your sovereignty, to what it means to live in your society, to me, that's not something you want, someone who's not responsive to the democratic process to be doing. Right? Diplomacy is something that is inherently a political act. It's committing an entire governance structure or an entire country or federation to certain things. And to make those commitments, on behalf of an entire society is something that people who are responsive to a diplomatic process, or a democratic process, really should be doing. So you don't want your security forces doing your diplomacy any more than you want your security forces making other core policy decisions. You want that to be through the civilian, ultimately responsive to the democratically elected or chosen leadership. So I love the diplomacy in Star Trek. They show it quite well oftentimes in terms of the process and what that looks like, but who's doing it is a little bit concerning. If it were up to me, we would have diplomats, maybe permanently or certainly more often stationed on these starships. They're doing a lot of first contact missions. They're negotiating a lot of problems and solving things. And I think it would make sense to have someone, or more than someone who has that skill set on board, quite frankly. And that would be a really interesting wrinkle I wish we had seen.
Well, it's a great point that diplomacy is pretty hard, and it's good to have professionals with experience. As we could see in many episodes of Star Trek, the whole episode is not everyone sitting around the table and having a collegial discussion. So that might indicate some of the challenges of having people balancing those multiple duties at once. Before we go further, I do want to issue a blanket spoiler alert. We are going to be talking about these shows. Some of them, if you haven't seen Star Trek: The Next Generation, then maybe this is not the exact episode of the Space Policy Show for you, but we are going to get into some details and specific examples, so just be forewarned. The one other thing I want to touch on that you mentioned right at the end of your discussion on Star Trek is the process. And I think one great example is the Star Trek Discovery season and how that looks at kind of off the record side meetings and the ways that diplomacy happens outside of that traditional view of everyone in a room with all the flags behind them. So what does that show in Discovery about off the record meetings?
Yeah, it's a great example because Star Trek Discovery in its sort of later seasons really has focused a lot on diplomacy and how countries work with each other and what the process looks like. And there's some stuff that's really good about that and some stuff that is maybe not quite as good, but I really want to focus on the good stuff right now because there's a couple things they get really right. And with the spoiler alert concern, put out there, let me just sort of tell you the scenario I'm thinking of. The basic situation is that, in Star Trek Discovery, the Federation has seriously contracted, a lot of member states left, and they're trying to expand again. And the Federation is trying to bring the unified government of Vulcan and Romulus, which is called Navarre in the show, back into the Federation. So they're having talks to get Navarre to re-enter the Federation. And Captain Burnham, sort of the central figure of Star Trek Discovery, is asked to be the military advisor to those negotiations. Sort of at the last minute, she has to replace someone else. And that, I just want to say, is very accurate. It is very often the case that you'll have military or security advisors on a negotiating team, particularly when you're dealing with issues related to security. So that part is great. I really like that they included her not as, the lead negotiator or something, but they have civilian negotiators. It's actually the president of the Federation in this case. It makes total sense for something big like this with military advisors. So they show well how you construct a negotiating team. A delegation is what we would normally call it. So that's a really interesting process thing. How you behind the scenes construct a delegation and negotiating team actually has a lot of influence on what comes out, because those are the people who are literally going to be doing the negotiations. So what we see as the negotiations take place in the show is that Navarre, the president of Navarre on their behalf, has some really serious concerns about re-entering the Federation. And she wants to include a withdrawal clause in the accession document so that Navarre could drop out of the Federation if something went wrong in the future. And that's the sort of problem that has to be solved. And as the show continues, what we see is, that demand was kind of dropped out in the open in the formal negotiations with everyone sitting around with the flags around a big table. And then they take a big pause, everyone kind of freaks out, and the negotiations are not canceled, but postponed. And then you see solutions developed off camera, or not so much off camera, but away from the table, right? Behind the scenes with one-on-one meetings. That is really good, because that is actually how diplomacy takes place. Like you said, when people think of diplomacy, the image they have in their minds, because this is what is shown to the public, is people sitting around tables or in the United Nations or something like that in a very formal setting, going back and forth, delivering largely pre-prepared positions and either reaching or not reaching a solution. That is not actually what diplomacy is. That is what's shown to the public. But I'm just going to pull back the curtain a little and tell you that's not how you reach solutions. That's not how compromises actually happen. How compromises and solutions actually happen is on all these side conversations. When the cameras are off, when oftentimes your other negotiating team members aren't even listening, you will, have a coffee break, take a walk down the hall, and brainstorm solutions with your counterparts. And that's really critical, because these kinds of off the record, in the background conversations give you a chance to test out ideas, because you oftentimes don't know what the solution is going to be. And sometimes the solutions you might propose might work. They might be, problematic in a way you didn't anticipate. They could make the negotiations worse. So it's really important to be able to suggest ideas to your counterparts and say, if I were to suggest this in the room, how would you react? And you can kind of float those ideas. And then if they show promise, then you can bring those concepts back into the formal negotiations and deploy them. And that's exactly what we see in this episode of Star Trek Discovery. So they really nail that importance of side meetings. It reminds me of a story one time. I'm not going to identify all the countries and all the issues, but I was at COPUS working on a negotiation, a multilateral negotiation.
And for those of you who don't know, COPUS is the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space.
Thank you. Yeah,
that's one where the acronym has become its own word in a sense.
Yeah, that's right. It's the main UN body that deals with outer space issues. And we were having a pretty contentious negotiation trying to develop a document that COPUS was going to adopt. And we were kind of stuck, frankly. Every country was delivering their sort of pre-prepared positions, and we really just couldn't reach compromise. But we got lucky, because it turned out that a pre-scheduled fire drill or safety drill actually was going to take place at COPUS that morning. And basically what they did was UN security officers come in and they announce that there's a drill, and there's a big, voice talking on the speakers, and they turn off all the cameras, lock the doors, and you have to sort of pretend it's almost like an active shooter drill, right? You pretend that you're in a security lockdown. And so that happened in the middle of these pretty contentious negotiations. And so it put a sort of forced pause onto our public posturing and the public delivery of our positions. And that actually gave me a chance to sort of walk to the back of the room and have just a one-on-one conversation with a delegate from a country that the United States does not have good relations with, like really, really quite bad relations with this country. But we weren't on camera and we weren't taking official positions. So he and I were able just to go in the back of the room and chat about the problem. And we were actually able to develop a solution that worked for everyone. And then when the security drill was over, we came back. One of us suggested the solution and the other was already ready and able to give a big thumbs up. And we solved the problem and we moved forward. And that's sort of an extreme example where you have a security drill that gives you that chance. But oftentimes you'll see people standing up to go to the bathroom or go get a cup of coffee in the middle of negotiations. But what they're actually doing is going out into the hallway to talk with their counterparts. And sometimes that's prearranged. Sometimes you give them a wink or a head nod out to the hallway. And so that's a really good example from Star Trek about the absolute centrality. That's where the real work happens. So I'm really glad that they covered that and showed that to the world.
Yeah, mid-drill negotiation sounds exactly like something that you could probably find in one of the hundreds of Star Trek episodes out there. But let's switch to a different show, one that focuses on a different vision of what the future is, and that's The Expanse. So the Expanse has received a lot of praise for how accurate some of the representations of the physics are. Not all of the representations of physics, but some. But how accurate is the Expanse on the politics side and its vision of geopolitics and the multipolar system in the future?
It's really good. I think the Expanse is, I'm obviously, wearing an Expanse show right now. I think one of the best things about it isn't just the great physics and the great world building, but it is that treatment of a multipolar world. So for those of you who haven't watched it, you have a bunch of different factions throughout the solar system. You've got sort of the inner planets, which would be Earth, which is under control of the United Nations at that point. You have Mars, which is its own country, let's say. Then you have sort of a loose confederation of what's called belters, people who live out in the asteroid belt and beyond into deep space. And they all control different sort of assets throughout the solar system. And what you see is constant jockeying between those powers for influence and control over the solar system and resources. And it does a really good job of showing how unstable a multipolar world is really inherently. History has shown us, you think back to World War I and all the shifting alliances that really partly led to that conflict, how unstable it is when you have multiple powers who are not exactly at parity, but who are each able to, let's say, engage in military conflict or press each other in a substantial way and threaten each other, quite frankly. In a situation like that, you end up with constantly shifting alliances. And that's exactly what we see in the Expanse. And in the Expanse, just like in the real world, a situation like that leads to war. So it's just a really good treatment of how you set up the universe in that way in a multipolar sense, and it becomes inherently dangerous. Adding to that complexity in the Expanse, just like in the real world, is you of course have the influence of non-state actors, which we're seeing really become absolutely central to our real world diplomacy and our real world geopolitics. In the Expanse, you have a number of sort of powerful corporations that are able to build spaceships and go out and do their own things. They do research, they actually instigate multiple armed conflicts in that show. And we haven't seen that so much in the real world, with a few possible exceptions from history. But as we see sort of the rise of multinational corporations and the real incredible power that's held not just by governments, but by non-state actors, everything from rebel groups all the way up to these giant global multinational corporations, that adds to that complexity. And by adding those additional, let's say, actors into the mix, it makes it even more unstable. And it gives people lots of different ways to jockey for power. So I think the treatment of sort of that world in the Expanse is really absolutely great. That's one of my favorite things about it.
And if I can lean on your expertise as a space lawyer for a second and give some context of what do we have now in terms of space law that is relevant to some of the behaviors that you see in the Expanse. So what are the existing kind of laws and behaviors that are allowed and not allowed when it comes to activities on the moon, using space resources? What's the current level of what we have in terms of space law for that?
So right now we have a system that is very much the product of the 20th century and very much the product of, well, what's reality, which is that everything is sort of pointed back at Earth, right? So the system we have now, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, is one in which everything that you do in space, whether you're a non-state actor, company, or a government, it's all ultimately the job of governments, the signatories to the Outer Space Treaty, to be responsible for that. They have, the legal term is they have to authorize and supervise those activities. So everything legally speaking and practically speaking so far points back to Earth in our real world, right? And it points back to what national policies and national laws and goals are. So for example, if you're a company that wants to go mine space resources on the moon, you can do that, although you can't claim territory. Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty prevents claims of territory, but you can own the extracted resources. At least that's the US government position. And it's really the responsibility of the United States or whatever government to govern that. But In the expanse, because humanity has moved on, they don't just live on Earth, they actually live on Mars and the asteroid belt, and they can, they have their own political entities, and they kind of spend their entire lives out there in space. You see a system where our current model just wouldn't work, right? You couldn't reference back to Earth for everything. You have actual political entities based and working in outer space. So I really think, people ask me sometimes, does the Outer Space Treaty need to change? Does it need to be amended? Do we need something new? And I think the answer to that right now is no. But if we did have a world like the Expanse, where people are living and working and engaging in commerce in space, like space to space kinds of transactions, let alone people who want to have their own country or govern themselves in outer space, those are the kinds of things that would really put a fundamental, I think it would be almost impossible for the Outer Space Treaty to address. It's just not built for that. It's built very Earth-centric and nation-state-centric in that context. So that's one of the really cool things, somewhere between now, present day, and the Expanse world, if you sort of think of those as on the same continuity, that the Expanse is in our future, the legal situation and the policy situation is going to have to shift. And that questions of sovereignty, questions of governance are going to have to go off-world, right? We can't always be looking to Earth, not just for resources, but also for that political and governance leadership. I think that's what's really interesting to me too, is imagining what happened between now and the early 21st century and what happens in the world of the Expanse and all the political and legal changes that have to happen to make that real and support that kind of future.
And that really ties back to the introduction to this whole discussion on how people think about those dynamics all the time when it comes to technology. How do we get from today to the vision of technology seen in a lot of sci-fi shows? But it's the same challenge of evolution and change and what events lead you on the right path that you could see in policy and diplomacy. But the one other thing I wanted to bring up from the Expanse really ties back to the discussion of those side conversations and personal relationships that you mentioned with Star Trek. But instead of looking at personal discussions, what about personal credibility? And how does that come into play in the Expanse and with how you've seen discussions happen in real life?
Yeah, this is an issue that's handled really well in the Expanse. I think it's in the last season. I mentioned all of the sort of multi-party maneuvering that goes on in the Expanse. And one of the issues that comes up in that show is that the United Nations, sort of representing Earth and the inner planets, is trying to create an alliance with a faction within the Belters. And the United Nations Secretary General, Avasarala, who's this amazing character, she's trying to solidify this alliance with a faction of the Belters to sort of support them in a conflict with the larger faction of the Belters in an armed conflict that's happening. And there's a huge amount of distrust between the Belters and between the inner planets and Earth in particular, because of all kinds of historical good reasons, right? The Belters have been taken advantage of and repressed and all of this stuff. So solidifying these alliances is really impossible, just using sort of traditional diplomatic tools. So what you see the Secretary General do in the show is physically go out to a Belter-controlled station, put herself physically in the hands of the faction that she's trying to ally with. And she says that I as a person, will make this alliance work. She puts her personal credibility on the line. And it's really interesting. I went back and watched this episode again to confirm something, but the way she uses even things like pronouns shifts, right? Instead of just saying we Earth or we the inner planets commit to do the following, she adds in personal pronouns. It says, I will make this happen. I will make sure that we live up to our commitments. I think of this kind of personal credibility and using that kind of a tool as sort of I've called it before, like the nuclear weapon of diplomacy, other than actual nuclear weapons. And what I mean by the nuclear weapon of diplomacy is that it can be very, very powerful to use personal credibility. But just like nuclear weapons, not everyone has it. And when you do use it, you cannot put that genie back in the bottle. It's something that once used, you do not have anymore, particularly if it goes wrong. In the show, it works out by putting herself physically under the control of the Belter faction, and by saying that she personally will make something work. It convinces the Belters, and that's how the plot moves forward. And that is something that actually happens in real life. You see heads of state do it often, right? Presidents and prime ministers, because they're the ones in charge of foreign policy. And so they can kind of inherently link commitments to their personal credibility. But it's something that diplomats at lower levels do as well. You can't do it often, like I said, especially if you can't live up to it. And not everyone's in a position to make those kinds of commitments, right? If you're not in a position based on your job or whatever to ensure that your government or whatever side you're representing lives up to those commitments, then your personal credibility doesn't matter, right? If the other side doesn't believe you can go back and make that happen. But at least once in my own career, I have used this. It happened to work out, but it was one of the scarier moments of my diplomacy. Not because it was physically dangerous. I've been in physically dangerous situations before, but this was actually scarier for me because I knew I was putting my own credibility on the line, at least with a critical ally. And I told them that, this agreement we were negotiating, they liked everything on the paper, they liked the text, but they didn't trust that the United States would live up to our commitments. So it happened to be an issue that I had enough control over that I could say, if we don't live up to our commitments on this, I will go public. I will, sort of torch this agreement if it doesn't work out. And it helped resolve the problem. We ended up getting this country to sign the agreement, but it was really scary. And it's, at a much lower level, it wasn't as exciting as what we see in The Expanse, but using that personal credibility, like I said, it's the nuclear weapon of diplomacy. If you happen to have it, you can use it, but you have to be really careful. So it was another great treatment of diplomacy by The Expanse there.
Wow. Yeah, all sounds very intense. And speaking of intense, we've touched kind of around the margins at the question of conflict and the notion that diplomacy doesn't always win the day, especially at first in a lot of these shows. Though, of course, diplomacy does not stop entirely when conflict starts, and there's a lot of back and forth that happens throughout. But you don't have to be watching Star Wars to see examples of conflict in space in these shows. And so I wanted to talk about a couple examples of kind of dynamics of policy and diplomacy during crisis and conflict, and how some of that may play out. And the first one I wanted to talk about was in Battlestar Galactica. One of my favorite aspects of this show is how it really in depth goes through civil military relations in times of crisis. And that's something that we talked about a bit at the beginning from the Star Trek example. But how does this exploration of dynamics between the resources and the personalities between civilians and the military, how do you deal with that when there's conflict or crisis going on?
It's really hard. And Battlestar Galactica does a really good job of that. And they one interesting thing they do in the plot there is by the scenario is that there's very few humans left at all. So there's the civilian leadership is largely wiped out except for one or two people, and all of those civilians are literally living on essentially military facilities. So you have a scenario in which the military forces are even more important and, let's say, dominant than you would in sort of a normal society. It's almost like living in a military dictatorship as a practical matter, because you're living and breathing sort of thanks to the military in that scenario. So it really increases the potential for tension, which we see play out absolutely in the show. That tension is inherent in diplomacy and international relations as well. Security forces are trained, and it's their job to maximize security and to achieve certain goals. And those are obviously critical goals, but they're not the only goals that nation states or governments have. And it's the job of civilians, and this goes back to our first part of our discussion, it's the job of civilians and foreign policy professionals and negotiators to look at the entire suite of issues. So, not everyone's going to be happy with proposed solutions in a negotiation or in a foreign policy. And oftentimes you'll have security forces in Battlestar Galactica, certainly, but in real life too, saying, you're taking risks that I wouldn't take, or I want to take a harder line on these security issues. And that's a real thing that absolutely happens all the time. And at the same time, the negotiations aren't just happening with the external partner, with your foreign counterpart. Oftentimes you have your own domestic constituencies that you have to satisfy. We could have a whole conversation about satisfying the public, but you need to also think about your security forces themselves, your military as a domestic constituency. It's absolutely critical to keep them on board. They're going to have to implement solutions or support solutions that you come up with. So even if they don't agree with you, and oftentimes they don't, you still need to keep them on board and keep them, happy is not the right word, but you need to keep them in a position where they're able and willing to support whatever policies you, the civilian or governmental leadership, choose. So Battlestar Galactica, as a theme throughout the entire show, does a great job of showing that constant need to meet security and take the advice of the security leadership on board, but also to achieve broader goals for your society, and bring that military and security forces along with you as you achieve those broader goals.
And that dynamic of balancing different internal and external interests and goals tees up perfectly our final example that I want to talk about today. And really, at the risk of getting super in the weeds and nerdy, I would like to talk about the Klingons and the Cardassians in Deep Space Nine. And that example of conflict and the challenge of domestic versus external and international pressures. So why don't you take us through this case and what it shows about diplomacy and conflict?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm doing a rewatch of Deep Space Nine right now, so I've been thinking about this a lot. And the scenario, just very briefly, is that we have the Klingons and the Cardassians and the Federation, and these are sort of powers in this universe that we've known for a while. But we have a new actor that shows up in Deep Space Nine. It's the Dominion, and they're very powerful, and they're trying to kind of break up all of the traditional powers in what's called the Alpha Quadrant in the Star Trek universe. So what they do is they're able to shapeshift. They're shapeshifters. So they basically replace one of the senior Klingon leaders with one of their own operatives. And this senior leader instigates a war between the Klingons and the Cardassians. And this war weakens both powers, making it easier for the Dominion to sort of show up and take over. The operative is ultimately, through the show and in the plot, is revealed and killed. And the Klingons realize that they were led into this conflict by an outside power, and that they were being manipulated and being used. But, and here's the interesting wrinkle, even after they realize this, they don't feel like they can stop, because they feel like their own domestic audience, their own population, would not stand for backing down, even though they're losing, even though they're taking a lot of casualties. The Klingons, of course, it's sort of a heightened example because they have the Klingon concept of honor, and martial combat is really important to them, which is a good way to heighten it for the audience and to help us understand. But this question of keeping your domestic audience feeling like you're doing the right thing, feeling like sacrifices haven't been wasted, right? General publics fall for the sunk cost fallacy all the time. And you have to recognize that and deal with the fact. I don't want to go too far in this, but I think there's some interesting parallels to the Vietnam War and how long the United States stayed in that, to how long the Klingons stayed in their war with the Cardassians. Even though they knew they'd been manipulated into it, even though they didn't feel like they were winning, they stuck around because they didn't want, quote unquote, their soldiers to have died in vain, because of the domestic constituency, and because you need to maintain that support, even when you're possibly going down a wrong path. We've seen that in our own American history many times. So it's on the security side here, but just diplomacy in general. Whenever you're doing foreign relations, you've got to keep in mind that you've got at least two, if not way more, levels of audience here. It's your foreign counterparts, but it's your own population as well. And the Klingons are a good way to highlight that, because they have such an exaggerated sort of psychology or society with the concept of honor. And that makes them a good tool to see how domestic audiences react to different concepts. So Deep Space Nine does a really good job with that one as well.
Well, if we can end on a more positive note, at least, there were a lot of challenges in that situation. And of course, there are a lot in real life. But one thing I just want to wrap up with is that what I love about sci-fi shows is that no matter how out of this world the technology may be, the ultimate heart of the story is always the interactions between different kinds of people, their relationships, how they cooperate, and sometimes how they fight each other. But people, whether they be humans or Klingons or any other species or Belters, they all have interactions, stories to tell inside the context of science fiction and amazing technology. And so does this ring true for the space activities in the real world? Of course, I think it does, but how are people and their interactions at the heart of space today?
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's all about trying to achieve human goals, right? And by human, I'm going to include aliens in that too, Vulcans and Klingons and Belters and sort of everyone. It's all about trying to achieve goals, right? Technology is cool and it's fun in its own right, but it's tools, right? You need to think of technology as a whole set of tools. And on the human side, we also have tools. We have legal tools, we have policy tools, we have diplomatic tools. We have psychological tools for how we deal with each other and ourselves. And that's what it's really all about, both the technology and the law and policy. It's about achieving a vision. And that's what the best science fiction does, is it shows you not just the technological tools, as fun and shiny as they are, but it shows you or lets you sort of work through what it would be like to deploy some of these much more inherently human tools to try to achieve your goals. So that's why I love science fiction, because it shows you or gives you a chance to kind of game out what using those different tools would look like. And when they do it well, it can teach you then about your own world and about what might be possible, whether it's good or bad. It's a chance to kind of play those out in a safe space without having to do it in real life.
Well, Gabriel, I've had so much fun talking to you. I love that we got to combine a really exciting, entertaining topic with some real deep dives into serious issues of how diplomacy works. So again, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you, Robin. Thanks, Aerospace. This was super fun.
Awesome. Well, back to you, Colleen.
Well, thank you to viewers and listeners for joining us today. We hope you had fun. Now I have to run out and watch some of the episodes that they talked about. But don't forget, all of our shows are available on your favorite podcast platform the day after release. You can certainly find more about the Center for Space Policy and Strategy, our products, our papers, our research at csps.aerospace.org. James Liggins is our awesome technical director. Thanks for watching and see you next time.